Thank you very much. Um, and thank you all for attending today. My name is Stephen Mayer. I'm the chapter chair of SCORE Chicago. With me today is our presenter, Noelle Cerna of Cerna Legal Services. But before we begin, I just want to say a couple of words about SCORE. Um, for those of you who may not be familiar, we are a nationwide network of volunteers, 10,000 strong across the country. And we're dedicated to supporting entrepreneurs and small business. Um, we are a nonprofit resource partner of the Small Business Association. And here in Chicago, we serve clients, entrepreneurs, and small business owners like yourself in all 77 neighborhoods of the city, plus the south and west suburbs. We serve them in basically two ways. One is through education, webinars like this one on a whole variety of subjects. Today's is the first in a three-part series that begins today and continues next Wednesday and the Wednesday following. The two coming up webinars are going to be at 10 o'clock in the morning instead of 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But you can remember each Wednesday coming up for the next 2 weeks. This one today is about incorporating your business. The one a week from today is about contracts, either with vendors or contract employees, whatever you might have. The third one is about real estate, what you ought to be aware of if you're in a brick and mortar business, actually buying and selling uh, or buying or leasing property. The second way that we serve entrepreneurs and small business people is through one-on-one mentoring. And this is your opportunity above and beyond a webinar like this, which has perhaps 100 people on the line, to access the experience and expertise of one of our volunteers on a one-on-one basis. If you're experiencing issues, challenges, or just have questions how to get started or how to grow your business, I encourage you to go to score.org/Chicago and sign up for a mentor. And they will work with you, as I say, one-on-one on a free and confidential basis. Today's webinar is one of many that we host at SCORE. I mentioned the two coming up. Today's webinar is also presented with our partners and friends from PNC Bank. And so I want to introduce at this time Paul Laban from PNC Bank to also say a couple of words before we move on to our presentation, our presenter, Noelle. Paul?
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for welcoming me. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, thank you very much. These seminar opportunities are a great way to assist small businesses in providing them with the information that they need to make informed decisions. So when Steve approached me with this particular opportunity, PNC had no choice but to accept because we recognize how valuable this type of information is. And we at PNC work very closely with small businesses to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be successful, to hire, to promote, to grow the economy. So thank you, Steve, for the opportunity. Let me know if there's any other way I can really be of assistance to not just SCORE, but to the business community at large. And again, we are grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this. Thank you so much. Steve, can you hear me?
Thank you, Paul. We appreciate your cooperation and I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'll sign off in a minute, but
Your
before and
image
let
froze for a second.
okay. I'll sign off in a minute and let Noelle proceed, but before she does, just a couple of words. Noelle, as I mentioned, is the founder of her own small business law firm here in Chicago called Noelle Legal Services. She specializes in small business. And so these three webinars that we have planned today, a week from today and 2 weeks from today, are right up her alley. And additionally, she offers her services to the Spanish-speaking community of Chicago. She is a native Spanish speaker herself, and so she brings a lot of experience, and she's done this series of webinars with SCORE in the past. They've been well attended, they've been well received, and we really appreciate her returning again this year to do the series again. Without further ado, I'll sign off and let Noelle take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. First and foremost, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you to SCORE. Thank you to the BACP for making this kind of information accessible, especially to the small business community, entrepreneurs that are just getting started, those of us that need information, right? And maybe we're not ready to go directly to the attorney and we're not sure where to turn. And I sure hope we're not turning to what can be the black hole that is Google, what can be misinformation on ChatGPT. So it's amazing that we have resources like this to take us to some great information in about an hour. So I'm going to dive right in. The topic today, we're going to talk about the topic of incorporation. Essentially, what it means to incorporate a business, what is a legal entity, why should you consider one for your business, what are the different types, how do we create it? We're going to try to cover that process at a relatively high level, but I hope with enough detail and information so you walk away from this having some actionable steps that you can take, whether or not you have never incorporated a business or created an entity, or maybe you already have. Now, if you already have, there are steps you need to be taking moving forward with that legal entity in order to keep that in compliance with, and we're going to talk about specifically Illinois law. Okay, so I hope that everyone here will walk away with some very valuable information. Quick housekeeping, the BACP, our rep here, did mention, and I do encourage it, that ask questions, right? I am looking at the chat as well. I'll take a look and see if we have virtual hands coming up so you can go off mute. I encourage it throughout the presentation. I do not mind being interrupted because I think asking the questions as they come up is so much more productive sometimes than waiting until the end where maybe we've forgotten the topic or we've moved on. So sometimes asking the question in the moment can be very, very helpful and more productive. And maybe others have similar questions as you. All right, so last piece of housekeeping here. I am an attorney, and as a good attorney, I have to have a disclaimer for my own presentation that the presentation should not be construed as legal advice, right? We're here to educate around a specific area of the law, in this case, incorporating a business in the state of Illinois. This should not be interpreted as legal advice, doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. I'm going to answer questions. I'm going to give information at what I consider a higher level, right? So if you have a very specific question about your particular business, your particular legal entity, an issue you're facing, may or may not be able to answer the question here, but of course we can always talk about it separately as well. All right. Quick look at the chat. All right. So let's get started. Incorporation. Okay, we hear that word thrown around, but what does that word incorporation mean? Essentially, what incorporation is creating a legal entity for your business. Now, the moment that you start commercializing yourself anywhere, right? And that means you start selling a product or service, from that moment, the IRS sees you as a business. And if you do not have a legal entity, what you are considered at that point is what's called a sole proprietorship, right? So you see people that are sole proprietors. Being a sole proprietor, what that means is you do not have a legal entity, but you're a business. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to take that step to create that entity. And of course, we're going to talk about a few of the most popular legal entities here in the state of Illinois, which are the limited liability company, or LLC is the abbreviation, the corporation. I'm going to mention the distinction between what we hear often is the C corporation and an S corporation. So those are the two main entities, right, we're going to talk about. And there are more, and I'll explain. We're going to talk a little bit about the process to create that legal entity, to register it with the state of Illinois. When you create an entity, you do so at the Illinois Secretary of State. There's a form you have to send them, there's a fee you need to pay, and then there are ongoing obligations after that point. So we'll talk about that. I will mention throughout the course of this presentation, sometimes some topics regarding tax. Now, I am not an accountant. I am not a CPA. I'll mention tax elements of these legal entities, again, at a high level so you are familiar. But if you do have very specific questions about how a certain entity is taxed and consequences to you, to the business, reach out to your accountant, to your tax experts to ask those particular questions. All right, so is it required? Okay, sometimes, especially if it's an entrepreneur that's just getting started, starting to dabble in their entrepreneurship, I often get that question. Do I have to create that legal entity? And if so, when, right? When is the time to do so? Now, the short answer is no, right? It is not a legal requirement that you create a legal entity and opt out of being a sole proprietor. You could choose to continue operating as a sole proprietor because, again, that's what you automatically are the moment you are selling that product or service to a consumer. However, I do want to mention some of the pros, some of the cons, essentially of remaining, especially a sole proprietor and not taking that step to incorporate or to create that legal entity for the business. So if you're a sole proprietor, I think the biggest risk, and I'm going to mention this term a few times here, is that you are completely absolving, you're completely assuming all of the liability as the business owner of that business. Okay, so what happens, and I'll talk about it in more detail essentially, is that when we create a legal entity, what we're doing is separating the business from us individually as the business owners. However, when you are a sole proprietor, you are the business in every sense of that word and that meaning. Meaning you are assuming all of the liabilities, the debts, the assets, the everything that encompasses what that business is. As a sole proprietor, that's all under you and your personal name. Now, you can go and file, and hopefully I don't confuse anyone and I won't go into too much detail. If you're a sole proprietor, you can go to the county and file what's called an assumed name so that you can use a business name for your business and you don't have to, commercialize yourself under your personal name. However, just because you have an assumed name and are using a business name for your business, but you don't have the legal entity, doesn't mean that you have created a legal entity, right? So I don't want to go into too much detail there, but some of you may be aware, right? If you're sole proprietors, you filed for an assumed name, you're using a business name. However, if you don't have that legal entity, again, you remain a sole proprietor and you remain fully liable for everything that has to do with that business. To use the extreme example as an attorney, right? To use the example of what that liability could look like. If there is a lawsuit, for example, against a business, and that business is a sole proprietorship, essentially what that means is that that lawsuit is against you personally as the owner of that business. And you can imagine that if you have to pay out that lawsuit, or maybe there's a debt, you have to pay out a debt, they can go and recover against not just what the business's assets and money are, but also your personal assets, your home, your car, your savings, etc. Right? So again, that unlimited liability, I think, is one of the greatest cons of remaining a sole proprietor. Now, I put a few other points here, one being potentially higher tax rates. Yeah, again, that talk to your accountant, right? And that's going to depend on your business and how much money it's making or not. And there are different ways that legal entities are taxed as opposed to individuals and sole proprietors. Now, why would someone remain a sole proprietor, right? There has to be a reason some people stay that way. Sometimes people are selling a product or a service more as a hobby, right? Than as a true, this is a business that I want to grow and I'm going to focus on. Maybe in some circumstances, it might make sense just to remain a sole proprietor. It's something small. Maybe there's less liability depending on what you're selling. Otherwise, too, people fear that in creating a legal entity, there's going to be a high cost associated with it. There's more obligations now that you have to keep up with year to year, which there are more, but never unsurmountable, right? So we'll talk about what some of those are, but want to mention, of course, some reasons why someone would remain potentially a sole proprietor as a business owner. All right, so to return to the point then, and you can probably hear of how I'm talking about this, that I'm a proponent of creating this legal entity for your business, but the question then remains, okay, why? Why should I take that step? Why incorporate? Again, returning to the liability element, creating that legal entity, again, what it essentially is doing is creating that limitation of personal liability. How? Because that legal entity is going to be the one that houses everything that has to do with your business. And it's creating a separate entity. The business is a separate entity from you as the individual business owner. So again, going back to that extreme example of a lawsuit and debts and you name it, if there is a lawsuit against a business and that business is incorporated, in most circumstances, there are exceptions to everything. The idea is that the lawsuit is against the legal entity. And if you have to pay out that lawsuit debt, whatever it is, they should only be able to recover against the assets, the money, what that legal entity holds. And it's shielding, that entity is shielding you as the business owner so that they can't come and recover against your own personal assets, savings, car, home, you name it. That is what a legal entity is meant to do. It's meant to house everything that that business has and shield you as the business owner. Now, we'll talk about why maintaining your legal entity, fulfilling your obligations for that legal entity is important, because if you're not doing what you're supposed to with that legal entity, if you're not treating it as something separate from you, that's what's called, sorry to throw a legal term around, it's called piercing the corporate veil. And if we see that, and a great example is you're commingling money between the business and yourself, you pay for personal expenses out of the business account. Those are examples of piercing your corporate veil. In other words, I am, as the owner, am treating my entity as just an extension of myself. That could be grounds for demonstrating that you don't really treat that entity as separate. So we're going to just nullify the shield and the separation that that entity is creating for you. So that's why when we talk about ongoing obligations as an owner of an entity, pay attention. Those are important because they help strengthen that legal entity and the separation and the protection that it's creating for you as the business owner. Okay, so biggest point, right? For me, biggest reason why I may look to incorporate my business is that reason to limit that personal liability. Now, there are other, of course, benefits to it as well. If you're looking for investors, you're fundraising for the business. Investors will probably want to see that you have incorporated that legal entity, that it's not you they're investing in, they're investing in your business. Again, I mentioned tax benefits. Speak to your CPAs, to your accountants about what tax benefits there could be with a legal entity as opposed to being a sole proprietor. I mentioned credibility because in having that entity for your business, you're demonstrating that you truly treat that as something separate from, again, yourself as an individual. Now, other places where I've seen a legal entity may even be a requirement. We have someone from PNC, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes if you're looking for a loan, right, for your business, you may need to have that entity, that business registered as a legal entity. If you're looking for grant opportunities, might be looking for an entity. If you're looking to get certified as women-owned, minority-owned, veteran-owned, you name it, may need a legal entity, right, in those situations. So there are many more benefits and sometimes requirements to having that legal entity for your business that you could miss out on if you have not taken that proactive step. Okay. So that's some background, right, of what it means to incorporate, why you should consider it. And then, of course, we're going to go into your choices, right? And again, we're going to talk about the LLC corporation, but I will pause and see if there are any questions on this first kind of preliminary information before I dive in. All right, so let's talk about your legal entities. Okay, so we're going to talk about two legal entities, the corporation, the LLC. I'm going to talk about those two, but I do want to mention that there are many more other than those two. A great example of other two that are less used, but actually are legally required in some cases to be used are, for example, the professional limited liability company, the professional corporation. Those are two other examples of other legal entities you can create, again, among others. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up, and I brought up especially the professional LLC and the professional corporation, which is the acronym is PLLC or PC, because sometimes the state of Illinois actually requires that you have a specific kind of legal entity based on the kind of business that you have. Going to the example of the PLCC, the PC, the professional LLC and professional corporation. If your business is regulated by this is a long name, Illinois Department of Professional and Financial Regulation, acronym the IDFPR. They license a lot of professional service businesses, including things like hair salons, therapists, engineers, architects, kind of professional services. So there, you can go online, you can take a look and see what the IDFPR license is, right? If your business falls into one of those categories, which they will show you the categories online, you actually may be legally required to have a PLLC or a PC, professional LLC or a professional corporation. I bring this up as an example because many people hear about creating an LLC. Oh, it's easy. Create an LLC, create a corporation. And they go and they do it without doing the research, right? And then suddenly we're in a situation where there could be penalties or fines for not having the right legal entity for your particular business. You find out you actually have to change it. Now there are costs and a process, right, associated with making those corporate changes. So I say that, and I mention this topic because I've seen it firsthand, and because you're in a great point right now, right? Especially if you haven't created that entity, do your research, speak to your attorney, speak to an accountant, get the information, go to SCORE, go to BACP, ask the question, and get a little bit more knowledge before taking that step and investing in creating that entity. If you have an entity right now already, and I said something that made you think, and now you're going to go look at the IDFPR, you can still take proactive steps, right, to see if you do need to make any changes. Again, talk to your attorney, talk to professionals that can help assess whether you have the right entity, and if not, okay, what steps, right, do we need to take to make sure you're compliant with laws? All right, and Connie, hopefully I answered your question about why you would open a professional LLC. Again, those are businesses that may be regulated by the IDFPR. So go check out their website if you think you may fall into that category, or even if you don't think, just go check, go look at their list and see if you fall into one of those. Okay, so now returning to the two most popular entities, the limited liability company and the C corporation. So I'm going to start with the C corporation. It is the most well-established, the oldest legal entity in every state in the United States. It's the first. So the C corporation, what distinguishes it is that its owners are called shareholders, because your ownership in a corporation is stock or shares in that corporation. So think of the stock exchange. If you're on the stock exchange, you're a corporation, there are shares, it's that concept. Now, C corporations, they're the oldest entity. There's a whole set of laws in the state of Illinois about how C corporations are governed. And there are some requirements for C corporations that are a little bit different from LLCs, which we'll talk about. Now, the C corporation is required by Illinois law to have written bylaws. That's your corporate governing document, your bylaws. You should have stock certificates, whether they're actual certificates or you can have, again, I don't want to get into too much detail. You can be uncertificated certificates, but you have to track how many shares you own, right, in that corporation. You should have annual meetings of your directors, your shareholders, even if it's just you, having that annual meeting, that report of the minutes of what was decided in that meeting, any corporate resolutions necessary. Those are actual legal requirements that you should be maintaining for a corporation on a year-to-year basis. So, and that's the essentially the C corporation is the oldest, has some more requirements. And again, I'm going to mention the tax element, but what a C corporation is known for as well is that it has this element of double taxation. Why? Because a C corporation can be taxed at the corporate level. In other words, the corporation is taxed on its earnings, its income, its assets. But then if the corporation distributes money to its shareholders, to its owners, the shareholders or the owners may also be taxed on what they receive from the corporation. Again, talk to your accountants. There are different ways that this is maneuvered and this happens, but that's one of the main reasons that people now, with the creation of the LLC, which is a newer entity, have kind of veered away from the corporation and have transitioned more to the LLC. But in essence, that is what a corporation is. Very common still to see it today with many businesses. And I would say too, especially when there are business owners that are partners, right? Business partnerships, multiple owners, making sure that in those cases, you not just have bylaws, but you have a shareholder agreement, a contract between those multiple shareholders that demonstrates how that corporation is essentially managed among partners. But I'll talk about the concept of partnership a little bit in a couple of points here. All right, but that's the corporation. So I'm going to just look quickly because I see the chat. So a question here, VCs prefer Delaware C Corp. If we're looking, and VCs are venture capitalists. If we're looking at investors down the road, especially if we are looking to offer shares to advisors, should we change Delaware Corp to a Delaware Corp from Illinois? And again, all of that's a question that's very dependent on your business, on how you're going to be operating. So that's a question I would always be happy to answer, offline about your particular business, but it's going to depend, right, on your business, your investors, but and whether it's Delaware or Illinois, that's actually a good point and a good question there because it's become very popular nowadays to incorporate, or people think I should create my entity in Delaware, or I hear a lot about Wyoming because there may be some tax benefits, or other states. Delaware, you'll hear Delaware very often because Delaware is actually very favorable to businesses in the sense that there's a lot of corporate matters that are heard in courts in Delaware. So there's a lot of case law, there's been a lot of interpretation over corporate law matters in the state of Delaware. So that's why it's become like the state for corporate law. So many states follow Delaware's corporate law in their own state law, Illinois included, because every state does have different laws that govern their legal entities. So there are variations one state to another. Now, the issue, though, is if you incorporate in Delaware, but your business is really operating out of Illinois, that means you need a registered agent in Delaware, but then you probably also have to register that Delaware corporation in the state of Illinois. Now you need to get an Illinois registered agent. You may be paying taxes to multiple states. There may be fees that you're paying to multiple states. And again, whether it makes sense or not, it depends on your business. It depends on your goals, what you're trying to accomplish. But have that conversation with an attorney first before you make that decision. And don't always assume that I should incorporate in another state just because I've heard that it's more beneficial to me. It's my 2 cents on Delaware and Wyoming and those other states you hear about incorporating. Other question here. I'm regulated by the IDFPR, have incorporated as an LLC, wasn't aware of the professional option. Currently, I have your single member LLC. Does that matter? or would I still need to have a professional LLC as a single member LLC? So whether you're single member or multiple member, single member just means you're one owner of that LLC, because we'll talk about it. The owners of an LLC are called members. So it doesn't matter if you're single member, multi-member, if you're regulated by the IDFPR, you may need to have that professional LLC, professional corporation, but can always talk in more detail, because again, it sometimes does depend on the particular business as well. Okay, but really good questions. All right. And I think there's a Q&A. There's a chat and there's a Q&A function. So I'm seeing what happens if you are a partnership. We'll talk about partnerships. If I am a sole ownership, can I still be certified as veteran owned? Yes. And if you are a veteran and you have 51% or more ownership in your entity, you may qualify for that veteran owned business. But again, talk to experts in that area, and it depends. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the limited liability company. Now, the LLC was created, this kind of entity was created after corporations. And the reason an LLC was created in different states is because we wanted to create an entity that had a little bit more flexibility than the corporation. And the LLC is still decades, long established. Like we're all much more familiar with LLCs. Like they've been used in business for many, many years. They just happen to be a little bit younger than the corporation. LLCs, the owners, like I mentioned earlier, of an LLC are called members. You have more flexibility, I will say, when it comes to LLCs, because according to Illinois, in particular, LLC laws, unlike a corporation, you're not required to have written bylaws. Bylaws are a corporation thing. For an LLC, it's called an operating agreement. Legally, you're not required to have this operating agreement, which an operating agreement essentially explains how is this LLC managed, who is the owner, how can you add owners or remove them, what happens if I am the only owner of this LLC and I pass away, I can name a successor to myself there, things like that, right? It's the governing document of your LLC. While I think it's extremely important to have that document for your LLC, it's not a legal requirement in the sense that bylaws are a legal requirement for a corporation. There is, again, under law, no requirement that the owners have an annual meeting. You don't have to have minutes. But again, it's still good practice to do it. It's just not legally mandated under state law. So that's what I mean by flexibility, right? There's less rigor in the legal requirements to maintain that entity year to year. From a tax perspective, more options as well. But again, talk to your accountants about the tax elements of your entities. But that's essentially the difference. A little more flexibility in an LLC, still just as important to maintain different, protections, operating agreements, your bylaws, all of that is still going to be important, whether you have that LLC or you have that C corporation as well. Now, I'm going to mention the S corporation, primarily because I see a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion about an S corporation. You may hear the word S corporation thrown around. Now, I want it to be very clear. An S corporation is not a legal entity, okay? You cannot go to the Illinois Secretary of State and create or register an S corporation. Not an option. An S corporation is a tax election. What do I mean by that? I mean, I can go to the Secretary of State and register a C corporation. I can register an LLC. Here you go, says the Secretary of State, here is your legal entity. Great. Now I can go and send the IRS a form asking the IRS to tax my C corporation or my LLC as an S corporation. I think S corporations are terribly named because it has the word corporation in it, so we all assume it's a legal entity, but it's not. Now, why would someone make that choice to be taxed as an S corp? Your accountant can explain. Sometimes there may be some benefits to it. Depends on your business, depends on your revenue, depends on how many employees you have. That's why some people may be advised to elect to be taxed as an S Corp. But again, what I want to emphasize from a legal perspective, you do not have a S corporation as a legal entity. You have a C Corp, you have an LLC, you have something else, but you do not have an S Corp as your legal entity. So just something to keep in mind there. And if you think you have an S Corp, which you may have an S Corp in the sense that you are taxed as an S Corp, go do the research and see, okay, but what was I actually registered as a legal entity when I created this entity? Because that's what's going to determine what my obligations are with respect to that legal entity on a year-to-year basis. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. Now I see a question here. Have you worked with nonprofits that have a for-profit arm, like a social enterprise? That's, oh man, the complexity behind non-for-profit corporations and then having the for-profit arm, that's a whole other discussion. I will say I'm not an expert in non-for-profit corporations. It's an entity you create with the state. We know how to put together those non-for-profit corporations, but there is a lot of tax considerations if you have a for-profit element of it, because you may be jeopardizing the tax exempt piece of your not-for-profit. So I'm not going to go into details. I would say speak to one, an attorney that's familiar with non-for-profits, and two, an accountant that's also familiar with non-for-profits. And not everyone is, so make sure you find someone that really is an expert in that area. Under S Corp, you would have full liability on your personal assets, correct? No, I mean, no, in the sense that, here's the thing, and again, I'm not an accountant, so you'd have to double check. I'm not sure if a sole proprietor can elect to be taxed as an S Corp. I'm not sure if that's the case. But that's the situation where I would say you do have liability because you're a sole proprietor. But it has nothing to do with your S Corp tax election. You have full liability if you don't have a legal entity. You don't have the C corporation, you don't have the LLC you're registered, but that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the S Corp status. Okay. Okay, thank you, Connie. And I wasn't sure. So Connie, I assume, is has tax experience, and Connie does. There you go. Sole proprietors can't be taxed as S corps. But so the question is, when it comes to that element of full liability, it's generally because you don't have a legal entity shielding you from that full liability. Okay. Other question I have here. Can you just add yourself as an S Corp, or does someone have to certify you? It's actually a form that you fill out. Maybe Connie could put the number and name of that form, S223. I shouldn't even say it. There's a form at the IRS. You can Google it. What's the form to elect to be taxed as an S Corp? That's the form you have to fill out about your entity, send it to the IRS, and they should help you then process it and and that's how you elect to be taxed as an S Corp. Your accountants are great resources. If you're curious about whether there's a benefit to do that, and two, to actually make sure you're filling out that form correctly. Thank you, Fabian. That's the form that they've put here in the chat. But again, talk to the experts before deciding to make that move, because, and I put it here on the screen, to elect to be taxed as an S Corp, there are actually some requirements. One, I think, very important one. Yes, you have to have 100 or less shareholders, 100 or less owners. Most small businesses have less than 100 owners. But each of those owners have to be U.S. citizens or permanent residents, right? So that's a requirement to be able to elect to be taxed as an S Corp. So again, do the assessment, talk to the experts before you decide to submit that form to the IRS for your business. Okay, so last piece here, I just put one bullet point, partnership, right? If you are in business with business partners, that means multiple people have equity or ownership in the business. You can be a C corporation, you can be an LLC. All of those can have multiple owners. what I think is most important when it comes to partnerships, and where I see especially disputes and issues come up, is that that partnership is not adequately documented. People don't have their shareholder agreements. They don't have, if they're an LLC, an operating agreement that acts as a partnership agreement among business partners. They sell their ownership to somebody, and all they do is change the information on the Secretary of State, but they don't legally document that process. Muddies so many things. That's where I see disputes come up. That's where I really emphasize, if you have business partners, document everything. It doesn't matter if it's your family, your friends, make sure it's in writing, make sure you're all clear, so that if changes need to happen, you have a clear path on how those changes need to be addressed, and you're doing it in a legally correct way, so that there are no gaps and no issues if and when it comes time to look back and see what the situation is with that entity. So that's my 2 cents on partnerships and making sure that you really do document all of that appropriately. Okay. Any questions on legal entities, the different entities I've described here? I'm going to talk about the process next of creating your entity and what you may anticipate. But any questions here? And great questions so far. Thank you for sending them. Okay. Oh, so I see someone here says, at the moment I have an S Corp for my group home daycare, currently working with a mentor at SCORE. I have a mentor too, they're great, just a plug there. Assignments, better understand why I have an S Corp instead of an LLC. So here's the misunderstanding that this is a good case study of that. Now, you probably have either an LLC or a C Corp as the legal entity you registered with the Illinois Secretary of State. You can look that up online. The Illinois Secretary of State and their business services page, there's a whole page where you can look up your business, your name, the business entity, and your legal entity and records will come up because that's public record. There you can see in most cases, sometimes it doesn't come up depending on how far back you filed it, but you can see your corporate filings. And the first one you're going to see are your articles of incorporation or your articles of organization. And that will show you what legal entity you created for your business. Again, that's different than the fact that you elected to be taxed as an S Corp. That decision, that's where you're being advised to do the research of why are you being taxed as an S Corp. That's a conversation probably with your accountant. I don't have the website handy, unless someone from the BACP or someone, is able to share that in the chat. But if you just go look up Illinois Secretary of State, business, what do I know? I look up Illinois business entity search. Like that's what I Google, and the page comes up where you can go and search for your entity. But take a look. If you're not sure, go and it'll show you in many cases what kind of entity you are in the corporate records. Thank you, Connie. That's exactly the site there in the chat. So if you're not sure, go check. It's a public record. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about process. Okay. So I have convinced many of you today that you should create a legal entity for your business. And you haven't, and this is the first time you're doing it. I want to talk about that process. This is going to be good for those of you that already have your legal entities as well, because I start with what sounds like the simplest point, which is the business name, right? So you can, before you go and file for your entity, you can go search the Illinois Secretary of State to see if the business name you want to use is available, because you want to make sure it's available before you go file and get rejected because someone else already has that name. That's the first place, right, that you want to look, is the Illinois Secretary of State for that information. You should also, I would say, Google it. If I Google the business name I want to use, what comes up? Who are the first results that show up? Is it another business similar to mine where there's going to be confusion if someone is looking for my business in the future? It's just a good, good research to do on your name. The third that I always recommend is go to the US Patent and Trademark Office online. They also have a search function. Or better yet, come to me because we do this for free. I think it's so important. And see if anyone else has filed for a trademark for the business name you want to use. And it's not just a matter of looking up every trademark of the same or similar name. You need to search based on the kinds of products or services you plan to sell. Now, if it turns out somebody registered a trademark for, let's just use a real life example. McDonald's has a trademark for its name, right? And they probably trademarked under restaurant services, food services. If you tried to file for the name McDonald's under the same category, you would be infringing on their trademark, okay? So that's just the extreme example. But if you go and you use a name, and then it turns out that someone has a trademark for that name for the same or similar goods or services, that's important, they can ask you to stop using that name. I literally saw this happen last month with a client. They received a cease and desist because they had not done that research. They hadn't asked us. We hadn't looked at it. And the other company was very valid in asking them to stop using that name. So you can imagine you've invested money in marketing. Maybe you made a logo, you have a website. Maybe it's been some time and people actually know you under that name, and now you have to completely rebrand. So I mention this point because it's a great step you can take before choosing your business name, even right now if you already have it, to see, am I at risk, right, of receiving one of those cease and desists, or is this a great name I should be trademarking instead? So doing that research, I think it's a really, really important step for anyone at any stage of their business. Question here. What if you're opening a franchise? Would it be better to name the business after the franchise or a more personal entity? Franchise, completely different, just different element. Typically in a franchise, you're getting a license to use that franchise's name, but it depends on the franchise agreement, depends on the franchise. So that's a different assessment in those cases. But again, I'm going to say there are attorneys that are specialized in the franchise area. Speak to them if you're looking to open a franchise and take that step as well. But there's different considerations for franchises. Okay. All right. One question here. So we're going to go back to the LLC concept, but I don't want to miss this question. They already have their company as an LLC, want to change the name so it's not so specific, more broad. Should I do the current name doing a DBA for the desired name? I don't want to change everything. Okay, this is a good topic too, right? Because DBAs, what that stands for is doing business as. In Illinois, that's called an assumed name. That's the phrase that Illinois uses. I have a DBA, I have an assumed name. My law firm is called Cerna Legal Services, but Stephen mentioned I do work with a lot of the Latin business community, so my DBA is Cerna Servicios Legales, so the Spanish version of my business name. That means that I can use both versions of that name. No one else can come and file for that name. I might commercialize myself under those two different names. Absolutely, right? If it's another name for your same business, yeah, you can file an assumed name, and that means you don't have to recreate a whole new entity just to use that name. So yes, that's something that you can do. Good question. Okay, so now, all right, moving through the registration process. We chose a business name, we checked it, looks good. Now we have to file the documents with the state. So if you have an LLC, document is called the Articles of Organization. If you're filing for a corporation, Articles of Incorporation. There are different forms depending on the kind of entity that you are registering. Basic information they may ask: what's the name of this business? What's the address? What's the name of the owners? What's their address? And then no matter what entity, the one thing you will be asked is, who is the registered agent of this business? I'm going to take a minute to explain what is a registered agent, why is it important. Quickly, registered agent in Illinois can be a person who is 18 years or older, or there are businesses that provide registered agent services in Illinois. Make sure you vet it. Their role is to receive legal documents on behalf of that legal entity. So if you have a notification from the state, they're sending you a notice via mail. If, again, worst case scenario, you receive a lawsuit, that's going to the registered agent of the entity. They're going to go on the Secretary of State, look at who the registered agent is, send that legal document to that registered agent at the address that you have on file. Why is that so important? Because if my address as registered agent is not up to date and they send it somewhere else, again, it's a lawsuit, even if it's your annual report, and I don't see it in time and I don't respond in time, there are consequences. So make sure that your records on the Secretary of State are accurate. Make sure if you change addresses, because you can be your own registered agent for your entity. But if your address changes, make sure it's up to date on the Secretary of State and anywhere else where obviously your address is a record. So that's some of the information you may need to include in that organizational document. That's a brief explanation of what a registered agent is and why it's so important. Okay, so this is a good question. So they're asking, is this something we would use if we don't want to use our personal address for our business? So I'm going to talk the business address. It's a really good question and one where there's concern because as you saw, your corporate records are public records, right? So if you're you work from home, it's a home business, you may put your personal address as the business address, but some people don't want that to be a public record. So I'm going to tell you the letter of the law, right? What business address are you supposed to be using for the business? The address you're supposed to be using is essentially the address where you are keeping all of the legal documents, all the corporate records for your business. If that's your home, then technically, right, your home address probably should be that business address. Now, there are some companies, there are these like virtual mailing addresses. There are services that may provide mailing addresses for businesses. If you look for those, do your research, ask them if they allow you to use their address as the principal place of business address for your entity. Some do not. So do that research. There are some companies that do that, but make sure that you really do the research and understand. But I would generally say by letter of the law, that business address should really be where your corporate headquarters are, where you have all your corporate documents. Okay. LLC cost only. I mean, so yes, you submit your organizational document to the state, and then you have to pay them a fee. Typically, fee today is $150 to register your legal entity. And then you send it off. The state reviews it. Hopefully within a couple weeks, they tell you, congrats, here's your registered entity. Another point I see here, when I did my LLC, the Secretary of State site recommended that I use my accountant or attorney's address. Depends on your accountant or your attorney. They may be able to be the registered agent for your entity. They could be the address of the principal place of business, but you need to talk to them and see if that's allowed by them or it's something that they can or cannot do. Don't just put their name and their address without consulting with them first. Okay, so we received notification from the state. We have a registered entity. What next steps should I be taking? I put EIN here, right? Because the EIN, employer identification number, that's essentially the social security number of that legal entity. Because remember, it's a separate entity from yourself. So once you have officially received the registered entity, you can take that step. You can request the EIN from the IRS. You can do it online. When you do it online, they give it to you immediately upon submitting the information. That number is important because it's the number that you will use to open a commercial bank account. It's the number you'll use to file taxes, all sorts of things. So really important number. Your accountants can help answer questions about it. I mentioned licenses and permits here as well. This is hosted, in part by the BACP. The BACP licenses businesses in the city of Chicago. Licenses and permits are so complex because one, it depends on the kind of business you have, and two, it depends on where your business is located, because often different cities, counties, towns have different requirements of what business license you may need for your particular business. So there's research involved. Talk to your town, has probably a department, a business licensing department. The city of Chicago, go to the BACP. You can go speak to someone directly, call them, walk into their office, tell them about your business. They will let you know what business license you might need. Do that research and make sure that you're getting the right licenses and permits for your particular business. Now, next and last steps here, annual report. So we have our entity, yay, like everything went well, and people forget that they have to renew it. Okay, so every year you have to renew your legal entity. That's what this annual report is. Essentially, it's your renewal document. You will receive a written copy from the state about a month before it's due, essentially. It's a paper copy, right? They don't send it via email. You won't get it online. You're going to get that physical copy. Important to file it. Right now, the fee for that annual report is, I think, $75 right now to renew it each year. That's where you can update information if you need to, though you can update that information as soon as it changes. You can do that directly on the Secretary of State's website. But that annual report, really important. Keep track of whether you've done it, because if you do not do it on time, one, your entity will go into what's called not in good standing, and we don't want to be not in good standing. If you're not in good standing for long enough, the state can automatically dissolve your entity as well. And now if you want to reinstate it, there are penalties, there's a big cost, and not to mention the fact that you have a non-existing entity now for your business. So keep track of that. Make sure you know when your annual report is due. You can go on that same website where you can look up your entity to see when the annual report is due. You can file it directly there online. It's very easy, very straightforward. So make sure you're keeping up with that. Lastly, I already mentioned this phrase earlier, piercing the corporate veil. After you have your entity, you got to keep up with your annual records. If you have that corporation, have your written bylaws, make sure you're doing your minutes, make sure you're keeping those corporate records up to date and having them stored somewhere, right, in your records. Make sure you're not commingling, like I mentioned earlier, funds from the entity and your personal. Just make sure you're really keeping that entity separate from yourself and treating it appropriately. And part of that is just complying with your requirements. Again, no commingling, and making sure you're not doing that piercing and treating that entity as just an extension of yourself. Really, really important to do. Okay. So I see another question. Can you do your annual report through your taxes? Not to my knowledge. Connie could answer, but no, generally that's a separate filing. Your taxes are something you do at the end of the year with your accountant. Your annual report, the due date for that annual report will be based on, generally it's based on the date you registered and it was officially registered with the state. It's 1 year from that date where your annual report is going to be due. Okay. Any questions? Let's see. So I see a couple questions here. So if someone had a trademark on my business name, would I have to change my whole LLC operation or just name? No, but I mean, if you ever are in a situation where you have to change the name because you got a cease and desist or something happens, or you think you're in jeopardy of infringing on someone's IP, generally it's just a matter of changing the entity's name. Of course, you got to change your domain and these other tangential things, but no, it's not a matter of dissolving your entity and creating a new one. It's a matter of changing the name, which you can do via an amendment to your articles, which you can find those forms on the Illinois Secretary of State as well. All right. I have a question. Can I explain a bit DBAs? And I did a little bit earlier. The doing business as in Illinois, it's called an assumed name. It's just, like I said, my example is my firm, Cerna Legal Services. Our assumed name is the Spanish version of it, Cerna Servicios Legales. It's the same entity. It's just I can use the two different variations of that name for commercializing my business. And you do that by filing with the state, and costs, it just depends. They do it in increments of like, you renew it every 5 years, so the cost depends on where you are in that 5-year period. Anywhere probably from $50 to $150, but don't quote me on that. Double check it. But it's not a matter of creating a whole entity. It's mostly just reserving that name so no one else can use it and take it. But you're using that assumed name because for some reason you also commercialize yourself under that other name that's not the same name as the LLC or corporation name that you filed originally. DBA, will it still be the same taxes as sole proprietor? So DBA has nothing to do with taxes, anything like that. Again, your assumed name, it's just another name that you use for that entity. So you can file many different assumed names for the same legal entity. Though why someone would do that, I'm not sure, but there are some situations where it might make sense to have one. Do you recommend setting up a trademark for your business name, or is that more if you're doing business in multiple states? I do trademarks as well, so I'm also very biased, but because I do believe in it. I think if you are intending to put your name out there, you are branding, you are commercializing, even if it's in the state of Illinois only, but there's a market to expand. I would look into it. I would look into trademarking that name because also it precludes others from being able to go and file and before you. And I think it is an important protection, but that's a whole other webinar about the trademark process. But if you work with an attorney, fairly straightforward process, and one that I definitely do recommend. All right. Any other questions? That is it. This truly is really my information. So if there are questions, now is the time. Really here, what I have on this screen is go to the experts, go to your lawyers, go to your accountants, ask the questions. I'm always happy to answer questions myself on free discovery calls, like send me an email. I really do love to educate and just be a resource however I can. But ask the questions before taking the steps because we want to make sure we're doing things the correct way so we avoid having to change it. We avoid being in non-compliance with something we're not aware of. And just having those relationships can be really beneficial, especially as your business grows over time. And I can absolutely share my website and my email. So this is my contact information, my email, my phone number. The phone number is our office's number, but you're welcome to email me. It's always the fastest way to get in touch. And I do host free discovery calls is what we call them, that anyone is also welcome. And I have the link on the chat to just book some time with me. I'm always happy to help. Question here, can I get a grant with just an EIN? That's a question for the grant, whoever is giving that grant. I'm not sure. It just depends on the grant and their requirements as well. All right, any other questions? Do I work on patents? No, but I do have recommendations for great patent attorneys because for patents, that is a whole beast of law. You want to get someone that's really an expert in that, but happy to share recommendations to attorneys I do trust. All right, any other questions? Do I specialize in trademarks as well? Yes, I do work on trademarks. So we work on your corporate governance, commercial contracts, which is the webinar next Wednesday, commercial leases and such, which is in 2 weeks, and then we help buy and sell of the buying and selling of businesses, and trademarks are the big buckets of what we do. And you're very welcome, everyone. Any other questions? And then I'll hand it over to the powers that be.
I'll take it over.
Thanks.
Thank you, Noelle. A lot of people are thanking you for the information. I want to thank you as well. Every time I hear you speak, I learned something I didn't know. And sometimes it's in response to our questions. Sometimes it's just something that you bring up that I'd forgotten about. So it's always worthwhile. I want to encourage everyone who is on the call today to consider the next 2 weeks. Noelle referred to those, but next Wednesday, another SCORE webinar by Noelle on the subject of contracts. And the following week, I believe that's October 1st, the third in this 3-part series on legal fundamentals. And that one is about leasing or renting or buying property for your small business. So if you're interested in those matters, you can again hear from Noelle. I would encourage you to go to score.org/Chicago to sign up for your own mentor. Sometimes the mentors can help you with these matters, but they can certainly help you with your business plans in general, or whatever questions or challenges that you're facing. And with that, if there are no more questions, someone is asking that I put that in the chat. I will. It's score.org/Chicago. That's our website where you can sign up for a mentor, one-on-one, free and confidential, as I mentioned. You can also see all of the webinars that are offered by SCORE, not only the Chicago chapter of SCORE, but around the country. There are a host of resources there that are free for you to use, including financial planning templates, business planning templates, etc. But I highly recommend talking one-on-one to a mentor who could really, first of all, draw on their own experience and expertise in business, and secondly, really address your particular concerns or situation. Thank you, Noelle, as always. I'll see you in a week. Hopefully we'll see many of you back here next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Look for the information from SCORE to sign up for that upcoming webinar. Thank you. Have a good afternoon and evening, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.